On July 13, 1979, at Kingston's National Stadium, Bob Marley stopped mid-song as 30,000 voices fell into complete silence. What happened in those next 47 seconds is a story that has never been told until now. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? The spotlight held steady on Marley's face as his guitar hung motionless, dreadlocks casting shadows across his frozen expression. Something in the crowd had caught his attention, something that would change how he saw his own message forever. It was supposed to be the biggest homecoming concert of Bob's career. The Smile Jamaica concert follow-up that Jamaica had been waiting for since December 1976. 2 years had passed since the assassination attempt that nearly silenced the voice of a generation, and tonight was redemption. The National Stadium buzzed with electricity as 30,000 Jamaicans packed every seat, every aisle, every inch of standing room available. Vendors hawked red stripe and patties outside the gates. Political tensions that had torn Kingston apart seemed forgotten, at least for this one magical evening. This wasn't just a concert, this was a statement that music could heal what politics had broken. The evening had started perfectly. At 7:30 p.m. sharp, the Wailers took the stage to thunderous applause that lasted 4 minutes straight. Bob appeared in his signature denim jacket, his guitar slung low, that unmistakable smile spreading across his face as he surveyed his homeland crowd. The energy was electric, almost dangerous in its intensity. People had traveled from across the Caribbean just to be here. Some had saved for months to afford a ticket. Others had hitchhiked for days. Tonight was more than entertainment. It was pilgrimage. For the first hour, the Wailers had been firing on all cylinders. Lively Up Yourself had the entire stadium bouncing as one massive organism, 30,000 bodies moving in perfect rhythm. Get Up, Stand Up turned the crowd into a revolutionary choir, voices rising together in defiant harmony that could be heard blocks away. Bob's voice was at its peak, his guitar crisp and commanding, his message of unity cutting through the humid Kingston night like prophecy made sound. The man was in complete control, feeding off the crowd's energy, building something magical with every note. Stop. What you're about to hear was never reported in any newspaper. At exactly 9:47 p.m., during the third verse of One Love, something unprecedented happened. Bob Marley, the man who had never missed a beat in 15 years of performing, never lost his rhythm, never broken character on stage, suddenly stopped singing. His hand froze on the guitar strings. His body went completely still. The microphone remained inches from his lips, but no sound emerged. And in that moment, 30,000 people felt their hearts skip in unison. But the silence wasn't Bob's choice. It started with the crowd. The first voice to fade belonged to a young woman in Section C, row 15, wearing a bright red head wrap. She had been singing along with tears streaming down her face, completely lost in the music. Then the man beside her stopped, then the teenager next to him, then the entire row. Like a wave moving in reverse, the singing died, not gradually, abruptly. One by one, voices cut out, as if someone was walking through the stadium, turning down individual volume knobs. Within 12 seconds, the most energetic crowd in Jamaica's concert history had fallen into complete, eerie silence. Bob's eyes darted across the sea of faces, searching for an explanation. What could possibly cause 30,000 people to stop singing simultaneously? The band behind him continued playing, unaware that their leader had stopped singing, unaware that the crowd had stopped responding. Carlton Barrett's drums kept their steady heartbeat. Austin Barrett's bass continued its hypnotic pulse, but Bob felt it, that strange magnetic pull that every true performer knows when something in the audience demands your complete attention. Wait until you hear what caused it. Then he saw her. Front row, center stage, maybe 8 years old. A little girl in a faded yellow sundress, her hair braided with colorful beads that caught the stage lights. Tears were streaming down her dark cheeks, but she wasn't crying from sadness. These were different tears, the kind that come from somewhere deeper than emotion. She wasn't looking at Bob. She wasn't looking at the stage at all. She was staring at something beyond the stadium, beyond the night, beyond everything visible to human eyes. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. She was mouthing the words to one love, not singing them, but speaking them like a prayer, like an incantation, like words that held the power to heal wounds that had never stopped bleeding. This single detail changes everything you thought you knew about that night. The child wasn't alone. Beside her stood a woman Bob immediately recognized as Sister Patricia Williams, a community leader from Trenchtown who had lost her husband and 2 sons to political violence just 6 months earlier. Sister Patricia's hand rested protectively on the little girl's shoulder, and tears, the kind that come from a place deeper than grief, deeper than loss, deeper than anything words could describe, were flowing down both their faces. They were holding each other up, these 2 survivors, finding strength in Bob's music that they couldn't find anywhere else in their shattered world. Bob lowered his guitar slowly, deliberately. The band behind him, confused but trusting their leader completely, gradually brought the music to a stop. Carlton's drums faded to silence. Aston's bass died away. The keyboards went quiet. 30,000 people leaned forward as one, sensing something sacred was unfolding before them, something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of the spiritual. The silence stretched like a held breath. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from Spanish Town Road and the whisper of evening wind through the stadium's concrete structure. Bob had performed for millions around the world. He had stood before hostile crowds in London, political agitators in New York, skeptics in Los Angeles who questioned his message of peace. He had faced down assassination attempts, police harassment, and critics who said reggae would never matter beyond Jamaica's shores. But this 8-year-old girl in a yellow dress had just taught him something about his own song that he had never understood before. One love wasn't just a message of unity floating in the abstract. For this child, for Sister Patricia, for countless families across Jamaica torn apart by political violence, it was a lifeline thrown to people drowning in despair. It was hope made audible. It was the promise that love could exist, even when everything else had been destroyed, even when the world seemed determined to tear itself apart. But the moment that would shock the crowd was still to come. Bob stepped away from the microphone stand. He walked slowly to the edge of the stage, his movements deliberate and careful. He crouched down, his knees touching the stage's edge, and extended his hand toward the little girl. The stadium held its collective breath. Security guards moved nervously, unsure whether to intervene in whatever was happening. Camera operators zoomed in, sensing they were capturing something unprecedented. The child looked up, her eyes meeting Bob's for the first time that night. Her eyes were ancient in a way that children's eyes should never be. "Sing it with me," Bob said, his voice carrying just far enough for the first few rows to hear. His tone was gentle, almost fatherly. "Just you and me, little sister." The girl shook her head, suddenly shy, overwhelmed by the attention of 30,000 people and the most famous man in Jamaica. But Sister Patricia leaned down and whispered something in her ear, words that only they would ever know, words that seemed to transfer strength from the woman to the child. Slowly, tentatively, the little girl stepped forward, her small hand reaching toward Bob's outstretched fingers. What happened next? No recording could ever capture, no photograph could preserve, no journalist could adequately describe. Bob began One Love again, but not as a performance, not as the superstar Bob Marley singing to 30,000 fans. This was different. This was Bob Marley, the human being, singing to one hurting child as if she were the only person in the world. His voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for this one small listener. The words carried differently now, weighted with intention and purpose that transcended entertainment. The little girl, gaining courage from Bob's gentle presence, began to sing along. Her voice was thin, fragile, barely audible even to those in the front rows, but it was pure in a way that cut through every heart in that stadium like sunlight through storm clouds. Her pronunciation wasn't perfect. She was only 8 years old, but every word carried the weight of lived experience that most adults would never understand. One love, one heart. They sang together, Bob kneeling at the stage's edge, the child standing on her tiptoes to reach toward him, their hands almost touching across the divide between performer and audience. Let's get together and feel all right. 47 seconds. That's exactly how long their duet lasted. 47 seconds. That redefined what music could be, what connection could mean, what healing could sound like. Time seemed suspended. The universe contracted to contain only these two voices, one famous around the world, one known only to a grieving community in Trenchtown, joining together in the most intimate public moment Jamaica had ever witnessed. And then something Bob would later describe as a miracle occurred. The crowd began to sing, not loudly, not with the energy they had shown all evening, but softly, reverently. 30,000 voices joining two, a reggae king and a grieving child, in a moment that transformed a concert into a communion. The sound was like gentle rain, like wind through trees, like the collective exhale of a nation that had been holding its breath for too long. Pause. You need to hear what the girl whispered to Bob next. As their duet ended, and the crowd's gentle singing faded, the little girl motioned for Bob to come closer. He leaned down, bringing his ear near her mouth, and she whispered 7 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "My daddy says you saved his soul." Bob's composure, maintained through assassination attempts and political persecution, cracked completely. The man who had preached strength in the face of oppression, who had stood defiant against forces that wanted to silence his message, felt tears begin to fall. Sister Patricia later revealed to close friends that the child's father had been Marcus Thompson, a community organizer and Bob Marley fan who had been killed 3 months earlier while trying to mediate between warring political factions in their neighborhood. Before he died, Marcus had made his daughter promise to keep believing in Bob's message of one love, even when the world around them seemed consumed by hatred. The night he was killed, Marcus Thompson had been humming One Love as he walked home from a community meeting where he had tried, unsuccessfully, to broker peace between rival groups. The stadium erupted, not with cheers or applause, but with something deeper, a collective exhale of emotion, a release of everything the crowd had been holding inside for months, for years. Grown men wept openly, women held their children closer, teenagers, who had been hardened by political violence, felt something crack open inside their hearts. Bob stood slowly, wiped his eyes without shame, and returned to the microphone. "Jamaica," he said, his voice thick with emotion, barely controlled. "This is why we sing. For them, for her, for Marcus, for love that refuses to die." The concert that followed those 47 seconds was unlike anything Bob had ever performed in his career. Every song felt like a prayer offered to the universe. Every lyric carried the weight of that moment when music became medicine, when performance became purpose, when a little girl reminded a legend why his voice mattered more than fame or money or recognition ever could. Here's something that will shock you, something no one has ever revealed until now. After the concert, as crowds slowly dispersed into the Kingston night and security began breaking down equipment, Bob made an unprecedented decision. Instead of heading straight to his waiting car as usual, he asked his security team to bring Sarah and Sister Patricia backstage to his dressing room. For nearly 3 hours, From 11:30 p.m. until past 2:30 a.m., Bob Marley sat on the floor of that cramped backstage space, talking with an 8-year-old girl and her guardian about loss, music, and the power of belief. The little girl's full name was Sarah Marley Thompson, her middle name given by parents who revered Bob's message long before that night in Kingston. Sister Patricia revealed details that broke Bob's heart and rebuilt it simultaneously. Sarah's father Marcus had been a devoted Bob Marley fan who worked the early shift at the Kaiser bauxite plant in Port Esquivel. Every morning at 4:45 a.m., he would play One Love on his small radio while preparing coffee and getting ready for the hour-long commute to work. Even as political tensions escalated in their Trenchtown neighborhood, even as violence crept closer to their door, like floodwater rising during hurricane season, Marcus had insisted that Bob's message of unity was worth believing in, worth fighting for, worth dying for, if necessary. Band members later recalled hearing quiet conversation and occasional laughter coming from Bob's dressing room that night, something they had rarely witnessed after concerts. Aston Barrett, Bob's bass player and close friend, said he passed by the room around 1 a.m. and saw Bob sitting cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in conversation with Sarah, who was showing him a small notebook where she had copied down lyrics to every Bob Marley song she knew. The sight was so unusual, this global superstar giving his complete attention to a child, that Aston stood in the doorway for several minutes, realizing he was witnessing something profound. Sarah told Bob in her 8-year-old way about the mornings when her father would dance around their small kitchen, playing Three Little Birds on his old Roberts radio, and telling her that every little thing gonna be all right, even when gunshots echoed through their neighborhood at night. She described how Marcus would sing Buffalo Soldier while braiding her hair before school, explaining that they were warriors too, fighting for peace instead of war, fighting for love instead of hate. Her small hands gestured as she spoke, imitating how her father would move to the music, how he would close his eyes and smile when Bob's voice filled their tiny house on Orange Street. Sister Patricia revealed more heartbreaking details that night. Marcus Thompson had been more than just a Bob Marley fan. He had been a community peacemaker who believed music could heal wounds that politics had torn open. In the months before his death, as political violence escalated throughout Kingston, Marcus had organized informal gatherings in their yard, where neighbors from different political affiliations would come together to listen to reggae music and talk about their shared struggles. He called these gatherings One Love Sessions, and they had become legendary in their small corner of Trenchtown. The night Marcus was killed, he had been walking home from one of these community meetings, humming One Love, as he always did, when he was caught in crossfire between rival political groups. Witnesses said his last words were a plea for the fighting to stop, a final attempt to broker peace, even as violence consumed him. He died holding a small piece of paper with Bob Marley lyrics written on it, lyrics he had been planning to share at the next community gathering. Bob made a promise that night that he kept until his own death. 18 months later, every month, he sent money through intermediaries to Sister Patricia to help care for Sarah and other children who had lost parents to political violence. The amounts weren't small, often $500 or more, substantial money in 1979, Jamaica. He never spoke about it publicly. No journalists knew, no biographers documented it. Even most of the Wailers were unaware. But for 18 months, until his own battle with cancer intensified and consumed his energy, Bob Marley quietly supported the family of a little girl who had reminded him why his music existed in the first place. Stop right here. This next part will change how you think about Bob Marley forever. This moment became the turning point in Bob's understanding of his own legacy. The 47 seconds of silence at Kingston's National Stadium weren't just a pause in a concert, they were a mirror, reflecting back to Bob the true power of what he had created through years of struggle and artistic evolution. His songs weren't just entertainment for people seeking escape from their problems. They were lifelines for people drowning in despair, thrown by someone who understood that music could carry messages that politics and religion and social movements often failed to deliver. One Love wasn't just a philosophy floating in the abstract realm of ideas. It was survival for families torn apart by hatred. It was hope for children growing up surrounded by violence. It was proof that beauty could exist even in the darkest circumstances, that human connection could transcend the artificial divisions that politicians and extremists use to divide communities. After that night, Bob's approach to performing changed fundamentally. He began looking for faces in every crowd, searching for the people who needed his music most desperately. Band members noticed that he would sometimes pause mid-song, scanning the audience as if looking for something. They didn't understand that he was looking for other Sarahs, other Marcus Thompsons, other families holding on to his lyrics like life preservers in stormy seas. Carlton Barrett, the drummer who had kept the rhythm going, even as his leader stopped singing that night, later said the experience changed how the entire band approached their craft. "We realized we weren't just musicians anymore," Carlton recalled in a 1983 interview. "We were healers." Every show after Kingston, Bob would remind us before going on stage, "Remember, somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear this more than we need to play it." The story of that night spread quietly through Jamaica's music community, becoming a legend whispered among musicians who understood that something sacred had occurred. Other reggae artists began incorporating longer pauses into their performances, hoping to create space for similar moments of connection. Sound engineers at Jamaican venues started leaving microphones open longer during crowd singing sections, understanding that sometimes the most powerful music came from the audience rather than the stage. Word of Bob's monthly support for Sarah reached other prominent Jamaican musicians, inspiring a quiet network of assistants that operated without publicity. Artists like Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs, and Jimmy Cliff began their own private efforts to support families affected by political violence, creating a movement that Bob's example had sparked, but that he never claimed credit for starting. Sarah Thompson grew up to become exactly what her father had hoped she would become. She earned a scholarship to study at the University of the West Indies, where she graduated with honors in education and wrote her thesis on music as community healing in post-colonial Jamaica. She became a primary school teacher in the same Trenchtown community where she had grown up, dedicating her life to helping children navigate the challenges of growing up in poverty and violence. Every morning before class, she would play Three Little Birds for her students, continuing the tradition her father had started in their small kitchen decades earlier. She named her first son Robert Marcus Thompson, after the man who had knelt at a stage's edge to sing with a grieving 8-year-old, and the father who had taught her that love was stronger than hate. Her classroom became famous throughout Kingston for its walls covered with Bob Marley lyrics alongside traditional educational posters, creating a space where children could learn mathematics and literature while absorbing messages of peace and unity. Former students, now adults with children of their own, would often bring their families to visit Miss Sarah and hear the story of the night when their teacher sang with Bob Marley. In 1994, 15 years after that transformative night, Sarah established the Marcus Thompson Peace Foundation, an organization dedicated to using music education to prevent youth violence in Kingston's inner-city communities. The foundation's logo featured two hands reaching toward each other, a direct homage to the moment when she and Bob had almost touched across the divide between stage and audience. Through the foundation, Sarah created music programs in schools throughout Jamaica, teaching children that their voices mattered, that music could be medicine, that 47 seconds of silence could sometimes say more than hours of sound. She kept the yellow dress from that night in Kingston, carefully preserved in a cedar chest her grandmother had given her. In interviews with local newspapers and international journalists decades later, she would say that those 47 seconds taught her the most important lesson of her life: Healing doesn't require grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes it just requires someone willing to stop everything and truly listen to another human being's pain. But there's one final detail that will give you chills and make you understand why this story had to be told. On Bob's final tour in 1980, during the Uprising tour that would be his last, he carried a small black and white photograph in his guitar case. Band members sometimes glimpsed it when he opened the case, but nobody dared ask about its significance. It was a picture of Sarah from that night in Kingston, captured by a photographer who had been overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. In the photograph, tears streamed down her young cheeks as she reached toward the stage, her mouth open in song, her eyes holding that ancient sadness that children should never have to carry. Before every show on that final tour, in Buffalo, New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, Bob would look at that photograph and remember why he was there. Not for fame, not for money, not even for the music itself, but for the possibility that somewhere in every crowd was someone who needed to hear that love was still possible, that unity could still triumph over division, that even in the darkest moments, one voice singing truth could light the way forward for others lost in the darkness. The photograph was found in Bob's guitar case after his death in May 1981. Rita Marley, his wife, recognized the significance immediately. She had heard Bob speak about the night in Kingston, about the little girl who had taught him the true meaning of his own song. Rita ensured that the photograph was returned to Sarah Thompson, who was then 12 years old and still living in Trenchtown with sister Patricia Williams. Sarah keeps that photograph today, 50 years later, in the same cedar chest with her yellow dress. She shows it to her students sometimes when they ask why she became a teacher, why she chose to stay in Trenchtown when she could have moved to Spanish Town or Kingston or even emigrated to Canada, like so many of her contemporaries. She tells them about the night when music became magic, when a superstar became human, when a little girl learned that her voice mattered just as much as the voice of the most famous musician in the world. The 47 seconds that silenced Kingston's National Stadium became the heartbeat of everything Bob Marley did afterward. In those brief moments, Sarah Thompson had given the reggae legend the greatest gift any artist can receive. She had shown him that his art mattered more than he had ever imagined, that his music was literally keeping people alive, that his message of one love wasn't just philosophy, but practical survival for families caught in the crossfire of forces beyond their control. That's the story no one has ever told. That's the moment that changed everything. That's why even today, when you hear One Love playing somewhere in the world, you're not just hearing a song, you're hearing the echo of 47 seconds, when music became magic, when a superstar became human, and when a grieving child reminded the world that some voices are worth stopping everything to hear.